Okay, so let's have a look, and then I can maybe fill in some of the gaps here. So I'm not going to go over everything or read your own sticky notes back to you, but I'm just going to touch on some of the important stuff. So .NET's cross-platform, it's high performance. It also has a very robust security model. Absolutely, we can write less code than we do in other types of applications. We've got caching. It's very powerful. There's lots of features. Absolutely, all those things are true. So MVC is, it's not specific to ASP.NET. Model View Controller, it's a program architecture. Okay, so we see it in ASP.NET. We see it sometimes in JavaScript. The first really popular web framework to use MVC was actually Ruby on Rails. So it's a way of organizing our applications. Has anybody worked with MVC at all before?
Yeah, anybody who's in COPR would have used it last academic semester in winter 2020 for our C# course,
Okay.
as well as in our Java course with Jarrett.
Okay, so it probably depends on who you had for those classes. So some people have, and some people haven't. Okay, so some will be kind of familiar with the pattern, but we'll go over it from the beginning because it is new for many people. So separation of concerns. This is really important. This blue sticky note. The main advantage of separation of concerns. Mikkel, you're in. That's great. Who put this note here? And maybe whoever did could explain a little bit about what separation of concerns means. Anybody want to speak to this feature of MVC, which is probably the most important? What does that mean in sort of plain everyday English if we talk about separation of concerns?
This kind of means that each section of the model view controller separates or addresses a separate concern. So in order to organize the code better, you basically divide it into the model view controller in order to handle the separate concerns and have them interact with each other.
Right, that's right. Thanks, Braden. And really those concerns in any application are the data is one concern, that's the models. The views or the user interface is a separate concern. And then the logic that sits in between and manages the interaction between the user interface and the data, those are the controllers. So as James mentioned, it makes development much easier. Right? So in an MVC application, we get many more files, but those files are much smaller and they're specialized. So just to show you an example, so I'm going to pull up a web page that we built in our PHP class in winter. So Jeffrey, Sierra, this will probably look familiar to you. So we built this little music library. So here's one PHP page. Here was our result that we built. It's pretty beautiful. And if we look at the code behind here, we've got a bunch of HTML. And then we open up these server-side tags. We've got a bunch of database code for connecting to the database, setting up a query, executing that query against the database and getting a result set back. And then we're kind of printing out dynamic HTML as well as looping through to display. So there's no separation of concerns here. We're working with our database, we're working with our logic, and we're working with our presentation all in one file. So the code's completely unorganized. It means that if there's an error anywhere in this file, let's jump back to the Miro board, trying to debug, as Tyler said, trying to debug this file is a nightmare. So as AJ said, yeah, it allows us to clearly divide these things. It compartmentalizes things, Jillian, absolutely, that's true. It also lets us divide the work. So maybe Jeffrey and Lindsay and Kevin are going to work on a program together. If it's a PHP application using traditional PHP, if each one of them is doing different things, they all have to touch this file. If we use the MVC pattern, we can say, Jeffrey, you're dealing with the models, you handle the database. And Kevin, you're doing the UI, you touch the view files. Lindsay, you're doing the logic, so you write the controllers. And that way we're not stepping over each other as developers. So we have many more files, but those files are smaller and much more specific and specialized. It also means our code is reusable. Okay, .NET Framework and .NET Core. So when we create a project, we're going to have both. So the .NET Framework is older, .NET Core is newer. And yes, .NET Framework, .NET Core is cross-platform. .NET Framework is Windows only. And we can use .NET Framework for building other types of .NET applications like desktop or server apps. .NET Core is really for web only. So I used to teach this class with .NET Framework, but .NET Core is really the direction Microsoft is going for web development. So last year I switched over to using .NET Core for this class. So if you go and watch the playlist from 2018, we actually use .NET Framework for most of the course right to the very end. Okay, so I'm going to leave the Miro board up. Again, if you're watching this video later, make sure that you find your learning group on Blackboard and post a sticky note into the appropriate question. Right? So I'll try to have some small regular activities like this. So again, it's not just me talking and us coding along. Try and add some variety and get some different ways of thinking about the material. And then this one isn't going to be graded, but in future classes, you'll get a mark just for participating in these small activities. So we've hit on a lot of the important stuff, but I just want to go over a few other things. So .NET's a mature product. It was created in 2002, and it was the evolution from Microsoft's old web technology, which was called active server pages. And those files had .asp extensions. So that's where we get the name ASP.NET. And that language is very much like PHP. It used VB script, so based on Visual Basic, and the code was interpreted, much like in PHP. So in a web server reads this PHP code, it's got to interpret one line at a time, which is very slow. So Microsoft had several goals in mind when they created this technology. They said, we want to be able to have our web code compiled. We can write it as script, but it doesn't run and get interpreted at runtime as script. It gets compiled down to binary, to ones and zeros. It's going to be faster and it's going to be more secure. So ASP.NET was really the first really common compiled web programming framework. It also brought object-oriented coding into web. And I know that was something many of you said you liked in the discussion board when you're introducing yourselves. I do too. PHP, VB script, they're really unstructured. They're not strongly typed languages. We can't use OO principles. PHP now supports object-oriented programming, but it's kind of an add-on. It wasn't designed that way. Whereas ASP.NET was designed to be object-oriented from the beginning. It also allowed us to write a single code base and deploy a web interface to the browser or a desktop interface using Windows Forms, which is something we can still do today. So that was in 2002. In 2008, Microsoft added support for MVC. And then in 2016, they came up with .NET Core. So until 2016, ASP.NET was Windows only. So finally, they've open sourced their platform. They've made it cross-platform available. .NET Core is also much faster. It's much more lightweight than the .NET framework. So our applications are going to run much more quickly. We see ASP.NET particularly in large enterprises. Now, it can be used for small applications because it's possible to get applications up and running, like my little project tracker, really quickly and easily. So the benefits are here. We've already talked about compilation. Visual Studio is a powerhouse. We don't like to put it in people's hands right away when they're getting started with web development. A few people mentioned this in the discussion board, that it can be overwhelming. So it's better in the hands of more experienced developers. That's why, we kind of do ASP.NET. We don't do it in your first year. It automates lots of tasks. So when ASP.NET came out, Microsoft said, what are all these mundane tasks that web developers repeat every time they build a new site? Like creating a style sheet, building a header, building a footer, adding in JavaScript libraries, creating registration and login forms. So all these things are bundled into Visual Studio templates. So we don't have to write all that code from scratch. We can just plug into these things and then customize them. We've got the benefits of MVC we talked about. We also have integration with a lot of Microsoft's other services. So SQL Server for databases, Azure for hosting, and GitHub, which Microsoft bought a couple years ago. All this stuff is really well packaged and integrated with ASP.NET. So these slides are on Blackboard in the Lesson 1 folder if you want to review them. I've posted them, and you can always view them underneath our Miro board. Here's the Lesson 1 slides. So Visual Studio has a great set of tools. It's got support for all kinds of different web applications. We're going to build MVC applications. At the end of the class, we'll build a simple API. You can also support for doing single page applications where the front end is using a JavaScript framework like Angular or a library like React. There are templates in Visual Studio. These are beyond the scope of our course. They're great tutorials on LinkedIn Learning on how to do these if you want. It's got built-in libraries for authentication, as well as all kinds of other packages. So Microsoft has a package manager called NuGet. So let's say we want to add functionality like implementing a Twitter feed display. We don't have to write that code ourselves. We can go to NuGet, we can search for Twitter, and we can find an existing code library we can add to our project and just plug in. So I want to look at, we talked a little about what MVC is. I know some of you have some experience, but I want to explain how this works in an ASP.NET context, and we'll play around with it a little bit before we go today. So let's look at this kind of sample URL. In ASP.NET, the URLs are generally very descriptive. So at this URL that I've kind of highlighted, what would you expect would happen? Like if we try to interpret this into English, domain.com/orders/details/1000. Based on that URL, what would you expect that web page is going to do? You can turn on your mic, you can throw an answer in the chat. What does that URL mean to you? Yeah, exactly, Suvi. Is find order number 1000. So in the orders table, we've got a record with a primary key value of 1000, and we want to display the details in the browser. So the patterns of URLs in ASP.NET, they follow a convention. So after, this is called the base domain, sort of the home page, the main domain site. And then after that, we'll typically see a word in plural, and this is typically going to match the name of the table in the database. So this indicates which controller, which logic file is going to handle this URL request. So our client clicks a link, it calls this URL, goes to the web server. So the web server inspects the URL, and it says, okay, I'm going to hand this request to this file. I've got a controllers folder that Visual Studio is going to build. And in there, there's going to be a logic file called the orders controller. And in this controller, it's then going to call a method or an action with the next part of the URL. So this file should contain a method called details. And then the last part of the URL would be an optional parameter. So in this case, 1000. So the controller method is going to take in this ID of 1,000. It's then going to make a call to the order model. So this is just a C# class that'll interact with the database. It's going to pass in the primary key of 1,000. So our model connects to our database, retrieves this order 1,000, hands it back to the details method in the controller. The controller then wants to load a view in the browser, and that file is going to go in the views folder, the subfolder that's also called orders that matches our URL, and it's going to have a view where the view file name matches the method name that's calling it. That will load this view in the browser and is also going to pass the order number 1,000 so the user can see it. So everything's kind of based on this convention. So the URLs are very descriptive, and we'll play around with this. So this way, the views and the controllers, they don't talk to the database at all, unlike in our kind of unwieldy PHP file. All the talking to the database happens through the models, but that's all the models do. There's no UI and there's no logic in the models. The controller is basically the interface, it's the bridge, so the models and views never talk to each other directly. Everything happens through the controller, and it's all URL pattern based. So it's a very simple and elegant system for putting an application together. So we sort of talked about these things already on the Miro board. So what we want to do is open up Visual Studio, and we're going to create our first MVC project. This is kind of going to be a throwaway project. We'll just play around with it a little bit. We're not going to keep it. We'll start to set up our e-commerce store next week. Okay. So if you want to open up Visual Studio, we're going to create a new simple project, and we'll just kind of poke around and see what comes in the project template. And we'll make one or two small changes just to get an idea of how this MVC flow works. I've kind of described it in theory, but we want to try it out. And then we'll wrap it up for today. No, you don't have to submit this project. Okay, so open up Visual Studio, and then you'll want to click on Create New Project. Now, depending on what version and what operating system you have, your options may look a little different than mine. So the option I want to pick, I'm in Visual Studio 2019, is this one. I want ASP.NET Core Web Application. Now, I also have the option for a .NET Framework Web Application. I'm not going to pick that one. I want this one. If you're on using 2017 or you're on Mac, this may be one option. You may not have two, but in the description it should include ASP.NET Core Web Apps. So I'm going to pick this option and click Next. There's sort of three screens we have to go through to get our project set up. So choose ASP.NET Core Web Application. This is why we had to make sure ASP.NET is installed in Visual Studio, like I did in the first part of class. If you don't select that option, you don't get this template. So choose Core Web Application, click Next. For today, I'm just going to accept the default project name because, again, this is just a throwaway project, and you can choose where you're going to save the project. So it doesn't really matter for today. So I'm just going to click Create, which will take me to the third screen. So now there's different types of projects. So there's an empty project, an API, a simple web application, an MVC project, or Angular React's Redux. I want the option that's highlighted, Web Application Model View Controller. One of the other things we'll need to do, but you don't need to do for today, is this up here shows you the different versions of the .NET Core software development kit, the SDK you have installed. I have the latest stable version, which is 3.1. You're probably going to want that for the rest of the course. If you only have 2 or 2.1, 2.2 for today, that's no problem. I'll post the link where you can install. The link is on Blackboard for 3.1. If you don't have 3.1 for today, that's no problem. You can get .NET Core 3.1 excuse me, on Blackboard in weekly learning and tools and resources. Again, you don't need to do this right now. The link is here, .NET Core SDK. So that'll jump you to .NET.Microsoft.com. Again, here's the item right here, the .NET Core Software Development Kit. So what you want is this one right here that says download .NET Core SDK. And this will run on whatever operating system you have. So this one on the left side, not .NET Framework, under .NET Core. We want the download the software development kit so we can build apps. This will give you the latest version. I think version 5 is under development. And then it shows up here. If you don't have 3.1 for today, don't worry about it. Just choose any version you have here. So I'm going to pick Model View Controller. I want to check this box. Mine is already configured. Under Advanced, we want to configure for HTTPS. This will force all our requests to use an SSL certificate, which in 2020, every web project website should have. So make sure you check that box, and we're going to change one more option. Under here, under Authentication, it defaults to none. That means all the pages are public and anyone can access them. We're going to want to enable authentication, so I'm going to click this blue change link in Authentication. And I get a little pop-up window, and I'm going to change it from no authentication to individual user accounts. That's the second radio button here. It then gives me this drop down in the center that defaults to this option, store user accounts in app, as opposed to storing them in the cloud. So I'm just going to keep that and click OK. I'll go over that one more time. I'll just cancel. So I'm going to choose Web Application Model View Controller. I'm going to configure HTTPS. And I'm going to change from no authentication to individual user accounts. We're going to do these same steps again next week with our in-class e-commerce store. And you're going to do these same steps when you set up your assignment project. You can add authentication after the fact, but it's complicated. So much easier to just set up this from the beginning. So I'm going to click OK. And then I'll click Create. If you didn't enable secure authentication or HTTPS for today, no big deal. You don't have to recreate your project. We're not really using those things today, but we should get in the habit of enabling those. So I am mindful it's 10 to 1. We probably are not going to go for that much longer, maybe 10, 20 minutes tops. So if you'll indulge me, I hope you're okay that we just carry on and then we can end a little bit after 1 o'clock today. So here's our project. One of the other cool things about ASP.NET web development is we don't need a separate web server to run our files locally. With PHP, you needed MAMP or WAMP server or XAMPP. Visual Studio has a built-in web server called IIS Express that will run our project automatically. So to see the files that got created, if you open up your Solution Explorer, so similar to for web development as for desktop development in C#, here's our project template. If you don't see your Solution Explorer, you just turn it on through the View menu, you click on View, and Solution Explorer is the first item here. Visual Studio also has this Team Explorer, which we'll use maybe next week. This allows us to connect to a GitHub repository, so we can just commit and push our changes right through Visual Studio. So we actually have a whole bunch of files here. So what I want to do is actually run the project, use the local web server and run the project. It's actually a working project right from the template without us writing even one character of code. We'll run the project, then we'll kind of investigate the directory structure, make one or two changes, and we'll call it a day. So to start my server, I'm going to click the debug menu, and I'm going to choose this second option, this start without debugging. There is a runtime debugger, which is great. We can actually step through our code at runtime when a page is loading in the browser. It's great for debugging, but it locks the code window, as you're probably familiar with already from doing Windows Forms development. So I'm just going to choose start without debugging. So what this is going to do is compile the code and then open up a browser tab and open my project. When you do, you may get a security warning because Visual Studio has a self-signed SSL certificate. So if you get a security warning, just allow an exception and say okay. It's not going to harm your computer. So you'll notice I now have a new web page open. It's using HTTPS, and I have a local port that starts with 443. So I haven't written any code at all. All I did was set up the project and start the server. So it actually gives us a little two-page website. I can go to home. It gives us a privacy policy. And because we picked authentication, it actually gives us a register and login page. So this saves us tons of time setting up a project. We don't have to create these things manually. We can change them and customize them, but we don't have to do all the work of writing all the code for these things. So let's have a quick tour of our project. The dependencies will list any code libraries we're using. So because we chose authentication, it added a couple of libraries for Microsoft Identity. So this manages authentication and authorization. It's already got the library called Entity Framework that we'll use to connect to a database, which we'll do in a few weeks. We have a www root folder that includes pre-built folders for CSS, JavaScript. It even gives us a default style sheet we can change. Under lib, it also automatically gives us the latest version of Bootstrap and jQuery. We don't have to use these things, but they're already here. So you'll notice our site is already using Bootstrap's mobile responsiveness tools. So it gives us, for example, the little hamburger menu. So you don't have to use these things. We can customize them, but they're here. So we don't have to spend time setting these things up. And then we've got folders for controllers, models, and views. Yes, it's really nice. That little project website I built it in like a couple of hours because I used all these templating tools in Visual Studio. Yes, big smiles for me as well. So we've got one controller called home. And in here, so our controller inherits from the base controller class. We've got a constructor. And then we have two methods here, index and privacy. And each one of these loads a view. So if I click on home, it takes us back and loads our index view. If I click privacy, notice the URL, controller name, the method name. So in the home controller, it calls the method called privacy. We won't worry about the data folder for today. Our models will go in here. Again, we're not going to work with models. We will next week. And then inside of views, you'll notice we've got home. We've got a home index method and home privacy method. So we've got views, index and privacy that have the same exact name. So you notice the naming convention. Index returns a view, but we don't actually say which view to load. Same with privacy. It loads a view. We don't actually say which view to load. However, because the view names match the method names exactly, these links work. If I go to /home/index, it loads the same page. I don't need home or index because these are the home is the default controller and index is always the default method. We can see that, or we can overwrite this pattern in this startup file down at the bottom. So in here, we've got some application configuration. So doing things like making sure we're using HTTPS. And then here's our default pattern. So if no controller is specified, then the home controller is our default. So in this URL, there is no controller. So it goes to the home controller, and if no method name is specified, it will call the index method. So if you want to change this pattern, you can change it, but this is the default. So I want to show you what happens. So our two built-in methods and views work. You don't have to do this in yours. I'm just going to rename my privacy method. Let's say I call this file privacy policy. So now there's a disconnect. I have a method called privacy in the home controller, but my view is called privacy policy. So now when I click the privacy method, my page no longer works. Let's look at what happens. It's saying we're looking for a view. If you call the privacy method in the home controller, we're looking for first views, home, privacy. We didn't find that, so then we tried views, shared privacy. We didn't find that, then we looked at pages, shared privacy. So this doesn't exist. So the naming convention is important. So if I rename my view back to privacy policy and refresh, my link should work again. Okay. Now we talked about, so two other quick files we'll look at, then we're going to make one quick change to the project and we're going to call it a day. So bear with me for 10 more minutes. We also have a JSON configuration file. So it's already got a section here for a database connection. So we're going to overwrite this later on and connect to SQL Server. So this is like a global application configuration file. Later on, when we add things like our Stripe payment gateway API keys or a Google login API key, those things will go in the app settings.json file. So all the settings are written as JSON nodes with as a key and value as a string. We can also set things like the environment, whether it's development or production or staging. So that's kind of our application tour, except for one other thing that we don't actually see in Visual Studio. I'm just going to open up, if I right-click my solution at the very top, I'm going to choose Open Folder in File Explorer. So we can actually look at the Windows directory. So here's my solution. And there's a subfolder of the same name with my web project. So in here, we see almost all the same things, but there's something extra here, which is the bin folder. The bin folder is really important. if I drill down into the bin folder, excuse me, this is where our compiled code lives. So every time we recompile or build our project, any new C# code, so new models, new controllers, they get added to this DLL, this dynamic link library. So this is what the server runs at runtime. That's faster than running the individual C# files. It's also secure. We only have to deploy this to the web server. We don't have to put our C# files with our source code on the web server. This is just binary codes, just ones and zeros. So we put our HTML views, excuse me, with our CS HTML extension, and we put our WW root with our front-end assets, but all the source code, all these individual controllers and models, these things we can keep on our development machines. We don't have to put the source code on the web server, which helps protect our code and make our application more secure. So when we change this controller and our site, save and recompile our site, then we'll see the DLL gets updated. So let's try making a change. What we want to do is we want to add one more page to the site with one more method and one more link in our navbar. This is only going to take us a couple minutes. Excuse me. So open up your home controller. And in here, we're going to make a new method. The controller methods almost always return an iAction result. So there's different types of results we can return. Most of the time, though, we want to return a view. We could return an error code like a 404 not found error. If it's an API, we could just return maybe a HTTP status code like OK. But typically when we load a view, all of those are subclasses of iAction results. So we're going to create a new method called about. Excuse me. Sorry, I know that's annoying. I keep clearing my throat. And it gives me an error because right now our method is returning an iAction result, but we have no return statement. So what code, if you look at our index and privacy methods, what code should go here on line 33 if we want this to load a new view? Yep, you got it. Suvi, that's right. So Lindsay, we don't need to, we can do one of two things. The simple way is just return a view, and it will automatically look for a view with this name. If we want to specify, or our view is going to have a different name, we can also do it this way. So maybe we called the view file something like this, then it would know. No, that's fine. That's great. I'm glad you you took a shot at it. Always good to guess. There is no bad. So we're just going to return a view here. So when I save my file, notice our DLL is time-stamped from when the application was first compiled, 12 minutes ago. So what I want to do is I'm going to click on Build and build my solution. And you'll notice it says it's rebuilt my web application 3. My build succeeded. And if I go back to my bin folder, notice the timestamp. So now our new version of our DLL has been compiled. One other quick thing about compilation. I think it was Sierra, I think you mentioned, or somebody else mentioned about, the challenge, especially of debugging. PHP, it was really hard to debug. Visual Studio, if PHP, if we make errors in our syntax, we don't find out until we run the page in our browser. If I leave something out here, Visual Studio will actually not compile. So the code editor says we're missing something, but if I try to build, and you would have experienced this in your C# class, right? The compile fails, and it tells us we're missing a semicolon on line 33 of this file. So with ASP.NET, we catch many more of our errors before we ever try loading our pages. So it makes debugging so much easier than in an interpreted language like PHP. Daniel, did it build successfully?
Yeah, it builds successfully, but the folder doesn't show any web file, let alone an updated one.
It doesn't have a DLL with your project name?
No, not at all.
Okay, maybe you can take a screenshot and try to paste it in the chat.
Yeah, just give me 1 second.
So I'm just going to carry on and then we can look at it a bit after. Yes, Kevin, absolutely. Debugging is horrible in PHP, putting in all these echo commands. So now we just need to build this view. So I'm going to go down to Views and Home. And if I right click, I'm going to choose Add a View. And I've got two options. I'm just going to pick a Razor view. Razor is just Microsoft's name for its view templating engine. I'm just going to pick an empty view. And I will call it About. We don't even have to put the extension on. Visual Studio is automatically going to give it a .cshtml extension. So these, I'm going to take out what's here, and I'll just put on some HTML. So just standard HTML here. Notice there's no header and footer. We'll look at that in a second. So now we should be able to try the URL /home/about. Our URLs are also not case sensitive on Windows, which is great. So if I try to go to the URL, it now loads our new page. Now we also want to add a link to it because right now there's no way to get here. See, even if I do it in lowercase, it still loads. So we want to go and add a link to this in our nav bar so we can click around and get back to About. So we've got a site layout in this shared folder. We've got a layout file I'm going to open up. And this includes our header, bootstrap link, CSS link. So this is our template. And if we have different parts of the site with different templates, we can make different layout files. Because we only have one layout file right now, all the views automatically use it. So here on lines 22 to 27, these are the links in our bootstrap nav bar. So I'm just going to add a new link here. So on line 28, I'm just going to create a new link that calls our home about method. So I'll use the same classes. Now I could use an href tag, but I'm actually going to follow the .NET way of doing it, which is using these little ASP directives. Instead of linking to a URL, we're being very intentional that we're using MVC and we're calling a method or an action inside of a controller. So I'm going to add ASP controller is home, and the action or method we want to call is our about method. And these method names have to start with a capital letter in our controllers. If I rename my about method to use a lowercase letter, Visual Studio is going to complain. Don't worry, I'll put the code back. So if I do this, I get gray and it says I violated the naming rules. So Microsoft uses Pascal case where method names have to start with capitals. Method and property names should start with capital letters. So if I save my layout, and Visual Studio nicely highlights the new sections, so in green, lines 28 to 30 are new. So if I go back to my home page, my nav bar should be updated now. So all the pages should have that new link. So now I can go to About, I can navigate around, easy. So we don't have to manually do all this stuff. Create a new method, create a new view, add a link to the nav bar. We're up and running. Okay, so it's about 10 after 1. So that was pretty much all we were going to do today. So we're going to kind of redo this. We'll go over this again next week when we set up our e-commerce store. I'm happy to stick around online if anybody has needs help. Are there any questions before we go for today? If you don't have questions, so the only two things I want you to, the only thing I want you to do for next week is complete the week 2 quiz. It's in the week 3 folder. So the week 3 folder on Blackboard, it'll be available. I'll actually make it available now. I wouldn't recommend doing the quiz right now. I would recommend you do it as a refresher sometime before next week's class. So it's worth 2%, due at 5 p.m. next Tuesday. So inside the week 2 controller, you'll have the week 1 quiz. So it'll be available after 2 o'clock today. Just 5 multiple choice questions. Other than that, I hope the rest of your week is great. Yeah, Kevin, sorry, the 2 steps for, thanks for joining, Suvi. The steps for adding the About, you mean? Sure. It was actually 3 steps. So in the home controller, we created this method.